Welcome to the Genealogy Professional Podcast, the resource for transitional and experienced genealogists who want to create a successful business. I'm your host, Marion Pierre-Louis. Here you'll learn from professionals all around the world who work in the field of genealogy. Are you ready to learn and grow together? Then let's get started. This podcast is sponsored in part by the Society of Professional Genealogists. You can find out more about them at www.apgen.org. Welcome to episode 14 of the Genealogy Professional Podcast. Today we travel down under to Sydney, Australia to get to know genealogist Carol Baxter. Carol, welcome to the Genealogy Professional Podcast.
Hi, Marion. Lovely to be here.
Carol, let's get started and have you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we're going to dive into exactly what you do and what's led up to that, okay?
I actually became interested in genealogy when I was still at school. We studied Josephine Tay's Daughter of Time, which you may or may not have read. It's the story of a police inspector stuck in bed, fascinated by faces, who in the story researched Richard III and the two princes in the Tower. It was the time of Eric von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods and books like that. And these books intrigued me in terms of the research process, the thrill of the hunt. But of course, what does a 15-year-old research? I decided to start researching my family history. And it was at that point that I actually thought I would like a career in the industry. This was about when I was 17, actually, by then. And funnily enough, I actually wrote to a man to say, with the Society of Australian Genealogists, to say that I was interested in a career. And he wrote back saying, no, there's no industry. Ironically, 7 years later, he actually employed me. But meanwhile, with no career in genealogy, I thought, what do I do with my life? And I went to university and I studied linguistics of all things and psychology and a few other things, and then kept on tracing my family history through all of that. When I was 22, I bought a one-way ticket to the UK to do research and backpacked a bit and lived in London and worked. And when all my friends were going to pubs and parties, I was sitting in my tiny bedroom writing an analysis of the origins of the surname Quelch. I mean, what a nerd. So when I got back to Australia, it was a case of what I would do now. And I worked for a little bit in the area I'd worked before in media analysis. And then this man advertised a job as project officer for the Australian Biographical and Genealogical Project, my dream job. And I applied for it and I got the job on the spot and basically worked for them as project officer at that time and later as general editor of the 21st Century Incarnation, which was called the Biographical Database of Australia. I worked with them until about 15 months ago. Meanwhile, I continued writing my family histories, and that's when I actually started writing popular history, courtesy of writing a family history that I had done.
Wow, there's so much. We've got to back up, okay? You're telling me that you're in your 20s, you're Australian, you go on walkabout to London, and you do genealogy.
Yes, I know. Am I not mad?
You're the only Australian. I spent a year abroad in London when I was at university, and I met a lot of Australians because, they all go to London, and none of them were doing genealogy.
Well, at the boarding house I was living in, I became the resident genealogist. So when all these people from Australia would come over and they'd say, now, I want to do a bit of family history research while I'm here. And I'd say, okay, what information did you gather in Australia? Nothing. And I'd say, we have some of the best records in the world. Also, we had a very small population, whereas England, Britain had a huge population. You've got to start back in Australia and then you can bounce yourself back into England. And of course, they'd look at me very sheepishly and go away and forget it all. But yes, where I went in the UK, I was by myself at that time. So I just went to record offices, and I used to hate the weekends because the record offices were all closed in those years. I mean, what would I do on a weekend when I couldn't go and do research? Yes, I was always rather focused.
So did you learn where your ancestors were from in England? Did you have the chance to go visit those towns or those counties? How much were you able to get done while you were in England?
absolutely huge amount. We're talking about, this is 1982, 1983. So in those days, we had the International Genealogical Index, of course, the Latter-day Saints Index. But there was, of course, no PCs in those days, let alone internet or anything else. So it was a case of ordering microfilms from the Mormons and looking at them, or really going and doing it yourself. So me being me, I spent 6 months before my trip preparing all my research to make sure I knew exactly where I had to go. Because one of the great things about Australian birth, marriage and death certificates is they contain a huge amount of background information. So if you had an ancestor who died in, say, the 1850s, you might be able to get back to the late 1700s in England, which English people would struggle to do based on the same sort of certificates. So I prepared a huge amount of research, documented everything I need. And of course, I only started to get myself organised clothes-wise or anything else the day before I was due to go in this one-way ticket to England. So I did all the research, but of course, once I got there, what I had was the tip of the iceberg. And by the time you can go beyond the basic church records into the parish records and the electoral rolls and the tax records and all those other materials, some of which now we can access, a lot we still can't, I was able to gather so much information that it took me nearly 2 years to process it all when I got back.
You got back and you were able to land this job at the Biographical and Genealogical Record, right?
Yes, that's right. The Australian Biographical and Genealogical Record as project officer.
So you were really quite ahead of your time to have an actual full-time career in genealogy in the 80s.
I was probably the only one outside of government. So you had people like the archivists and the Crown Solicitor's Office that employed historians, etc. But in terms of the project I worked for two men who funded the project. Actually, I'm not sure if you'd be aware of this. Did you ever use the Genealogical Research Directory, which stopped about 10 years ago, which came out annually and included lists of names, and you could contact researchers researching the same name. Did you ever use that at all?
I don't think that I've ever used that, no.
Okay. Well, that was a very well-known international publication for about 20 years, and my bosses did that, so that was one of their sources of income. My bosses funded the ABGR project with a couple of us they were paying. I was the project officer dealing with the early colonial records. So I got to look at my ancestors' records and be paid for it, and I was 24. Was that not bliss or what?
You were very, very lucky.
I was. The funny thing was, the reason I got the job was because they had met me before because of my letter to them saying I wanted the job. I also had done an awful lot of early Australian research because I had First Fleet ancestry, which comes the equivalent of the American Mayflower ancestry. So I went back right to white settlement, the beginnings of white settlement in Australia. And I'd also explored genealogy broadly, because I lived in the UK and all of that. So I had a very good knowledge of genealogy. But in my job as a media analyst, I'd actually had to deal with, it was number crunching via programs, and I had to deal with the computer programs that were available at the time. And they were dealing with a project that they wanted to use PCs and computers. So they interviewed 20 people, but I was the only person with all three skills that they needed. Everyone was either a genealogist with nothing else, or a historian with nothing else, or a computer programming with nothing else, but nobody else had all those skills. So it was incredibly lucky. But what was even more so is they only put out one advertisement, and it happened to be in the university careers guide of the university I went to. My brother was there at the time, and I hated the job I had, and I asked him to get the careers bulletin, and there it was. Did not sleep that night.
That's what we would call serendipity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then you said that it was about 18 months ago that you left off doing that and you started off on your own. Yes.
As it turned out, I'd been working part-time for them for a long time, but meanwhile I had, of course, continued doing my own family history research. And then I had decided to write a family history of my first fleet ancestors. So I thought it would take, I had about 200 family histories in the pipeline because that's how I always documented my own research. That's how I gained the critical 10,000 hours of writing, basically. So I decided to write this family history. I figured it would take me 6 months. It took me 4 years because I wrote 29 biographies and it was 400,000 words of text and 100,000 words of source referencing. So I know how to write. And I discovered this wonderful political sex scandal while I was writing the family history, and I thought, this might make a really interesting popular history. So I was always up for a new challenge, and I decided to try writing it that way. But because I'd never actually undertaken any writing courses and I'd never studied history officially, only what I'd read myself, I actually found a new voice, a much more immediate voice, because I didn't know this wasn't what you were supposed to do. And it made it much more like a novel, even though it's not. It's non-fiction. It's actually, the genre is called narrative non-fiction. So when I pitched it to a mainstream publisher, Allen and Unwin, in fact, they just loved it. It was the first publisher I approached, and within a couple of weeks they'd got back to me and said, we love it, let's talk more. And so I got my first contract out of that. And funnily enough, it came out of this family history. At that time, I had attended no courses on writing. I'd read no books on writing. I'd done nothing except for some writing at university, bar writing these family histories. And at that point, I figured I'd better read a few books on writing and learn what I was doing. My publisher said I'd come in at a very high level, and I realised again, because I read a lot and I'd written all these family histories and the occasional article, that had been the skills I needed, that really, the hard yakka skills that brought me the professional writing career. So my latest book was just published internationally. It's called The Peculiar Case of the Electric Constable. It's basically a true crime thriller, and it's received rave reviews around the world. I mean, the London Times said it was as lively and gripping as a crime novel. I've really got the kudos internationally now.
So all of the published works that you have are nonfiction?
Yes. I've never written any fiction. I wouldn't know how.
So when you left your job and you started writing full-time, it sounds like you didn't really have any transition. It sounds like you just went gangbusters, started writing crazy, and then you said, I think I better contact a publisher. Or is that an oversimplification of what actually happened?
No, what actually happened, my first book came out in 2006. So I was working as the general editor of this project part-time and writing the other part, the rest of the week. So I was working 7 days a week. And meanwhile, so I had An Irresistible Temptation come out in 2006, Breaking the Bank, which is the story of Australia's largest bank robbery in 2008. I'll come back to this in a second, but I had self-published Writing Interesting Family Histories in 2009 and then updated that in 2010 because I was being, at that point, asked to write about that. 2011, Captain Thunderbolt and His Lady came out, which was a bushranger story. Then in 2012, I got 2 book contracts. So I had The Peculiar Case of the Electric Constable, which I'd already written, and that one was the one that was published late last year. And I also gained another contract with Allen and Unwin for a book called The Lucretia Borgia of Botany Bay. So with 2 book contracts, now each of these books takes 18 months to 2 years to write. So it's a huge amount of work. 2 book contracts and part-time work. It just didn't work. And there were a few issues with my work. So I decided it was time to leave and to start a new era of my life. So I already had the 2 book contracts. I had a whole lot of how-to books in mind, but I hadn't had the time to write most of them. And that's when I started writing full-time, though really, in a sense, I'd written full-time before that because I just squeezed it around my working hours. But I'd already been speaking as well for the previous few years. People had started asking me to speak about my work itself, and then about the books I edited as part of my work. And then, of course, I spoke about all the popular histories that I was writing. So I spoke at genealogical and historical societies and libraries and conferences and all of that sort of thing. And as well, then I started to get asked to speak on genealogy cruises on research topics as well as on writing. So the whole thing I sort of fell into it, really. It developed. I didn't have any transition like other people would. I didn't decide I was going to become a professional genealogist. I just kept on doing full-time what I'd been doing before.
Did you have a transition financially? Did you get money up front from the publisher so that you didn't have to worry about money when you left your job? Was it never even an issue for you? It was just really you were focused on the writing and that wasn't a worry for you? You know, not everyone gets money up front from a publisher.
Because I'm mainstream published, I do get advances for each of the books. So people who get published in the niche publishers, like a genealogical publisher or a business publisher, often they don't get an advance. Academic publishers don't generally give an advance, but mainstream publishers do. Unfortunately, though, the publishing world is as it is. The advances, I mean, mine are all five-figure advances, but they are nowhere near the amount of time. They don't cover the amount of time you put into the book. So it's unfortunate from that point of view. So when I gave up my full-time job, yes, I suffered a massive income loss, particularly as I was writing these two. All my time was focused on these two books that, while, yes, I get an advance, it's nowhere near what I'd been earning before. So money, in a sense, has been the biggest thing. Writing how-to books, genealogy how-to books, is actually a better source of income, self-publishing. So this is one of the things I would recommend to all the people who listen to your podcasts who are looking at being genealogy professionals. And I'll talk about this a bit more in a sec. But it's the how-to books that make the money. And this is where this situation with this Writing Interesting Family Histories was an interesting one in itself. I was being asked, courtesy of my genealogical skills and my writing skills and my reputation, I was being asked to give seminars on how to turn dry facts into exciting narrative. Because most people probably are not aware of this, but in the mainstream writing world, family history writing is at the bottom of the heap, the absolute bottom, because it is considered to be fact-driven and tedious, which is what it is. So people saying, okay, you're writing this stuff that's getting rave reviews. How do we do what you're doing? So I started giving these talks called How to Turn Dry Facts into Exciting Narratives. And of course, as is usual with these things, and if we get a chance, I'll talk about that as well, you're not paid for your talk. So you're expected to give up your time and give your knowledge for nothing. They sometimes charge the attendees and you get a bottle of wine. And I had one situation where I was giving this talk to 50 avid attendees, and I knew if I had a book, I could have actually made quite a bit of money because probably 30 of them would have bought the book. And I was giving a talk to 250 people 5 weeks later, and I thought, I can't believe it. I thought, you're a writer, write a book. So that was on a Thursday night this happened. On the Saturday, I put everything aside, told my bosses I wasn't doing any work for a week, and I just went hell for leather and wrote 20,000 words in a week. I'd already been giving the talk, so I had the structure in the PowerPoint presentation, and I just went for it. 5 weeks later, I managed to have it published, came out in time for the talk, got the stock the day before. I walked out of that talk with $2,500 in my pocket, courtesy of 1 week's work.
So, Carol, are you trying to tell me that genealogical speakers in Australia don't get paid?
Rarely.
Wow. American speakers get paid to speak. They don't always get paid a lot, but they do get paid.
No, it's very rare for us to get paid to speak. There's a man who organises the Unlock the Past cruises, who you might be aware of those cruises. He does either pay us to speak, it's only a very small amount. He does a pay us to speak, or he pays for our fare on the cruises. But most genealogical societies or historical societies do not pay. Occasionally you might get paid $100 at a conference, but I've started doing a 2-day series of talks on 3 researching topics, again, principles and practices of research, using, again, the case studies of stuff I've done, how to structure a family history, 3 on writing and 1 on publishing. And those ones I've already done, and the Unlock the Past organiser is actually talking about taking me on some cruises with those and also taking them elsewhere in Australia. And I get paid for doing those. But generally, no, they expect you to do it without getting paid, for which you get a bottle of wine, and I'm allergic to wine, so it's not much good. And you don't get paid your travelling costs or anything. And every talk you give basically takes up 5 hours of your time. By the time you get up, you iron your clothes, you do your face, you get everything organised, drive there, etc. So yes, it's a bit of a sad indictment on the industry.
It sounds like speaking in Australia is really only beneficial to either people who have published books or people who are actively seeking research clients. Because what other gain would there be from speaking?
That's exactly right. And that's one of the reasons that I recommend genealogists who have a business, even if they are paid to speak, having the books at the back of the room to sell. Because once you've done a talk, you actually have the book structure now. It should obviously be more than the talk. The book should have more to it, more content to it. But when you are standing in a room speaking to people, if you have a book to sell, people almost feel like they want to walk away with something of you. So sometimes, obviously not everyone buys a book, but it's amazing sometimes. When I gave the Wentworth talks, for example, I had 5 books for sale, my 4 popular histories and the Writing Interesting Family Histories, and a few of the people bought all 5. Some of them bought 1 or 2, and the jump from there was 2 or 5, which was interesting itself. But what it means is, even if you are paid to give a talk, having a book means they carry away a memory of who you are, and they pay for the book as well. So you're building your income stream in not just the immediate way of you being there and being paid to talk and you being there and being paid for your book, but they then carry the memory of you through that book. And you're much more likely to get called upon when they say, oh yeah, I need some research done, and who would do it? I went to that talk. Where's that person's book? That's right, that's her name, I'll contact her. So I think genealogists in any profession, if they can speak, and a lot can't, but like anything else, it's just practice. You just do it, and then you get so it's breeze. And even if they can't write, again, it's just practice. You just do it and you do it. They can actually really build up both their profile and their income by speaking and writing.
If 2 people are meeting in a coffee shop in Sydney and one person has read your books and the other person is not familiar with you, how is the one person going to describe Carol Baxter to this other person who doesn't know who you are or what you do? What is your reputation? How are you known in Australia?
As a researcher, I have a very high profile. So I'm a fellow of the Society of Australian Genealogists, an adjunct lecturer at the University of New England, and which is more an affiliation thing. And of course, I have books come out in a wide range of subjects. So I do have a reputation where people say, oh, that's Carol Baxter, that sort of thing. People who have heard me speak, it's fascinating, the one thing that comes across, the word that everyone uses is inspirational, which is great. I love people saying that because I can actually say to people, this is what I do this, and if I do this, you can do it, and this is what you do. So what they would generally say of my books is that they are gripping. Even the Writing Interesting Family Histories, as somebody said, who would have thought a how-to book could be a page turner. So I have discovered a way to write that is very interesting. I also have the research skills, so people know that what I'm doing is incredibly reliable and exhaustive. And I also have the speaking skills that make me a speaker that people want to hear because I'm inspirational. So I guess people would use all those 3 words: skilled, high reputation, inspirational.
But they would identify you as a genealogist or a popular historian, or what would be the industry?
It depends on which industry they were from. So
Okay.
Writers, for example, would know me as a popular historian more than a genealogist. Genealogists would know me more for my lectures on genealogy and from my Writing Interesting Family Histories book. General public, again, probably more from my popular histories world. So it does depend upon the type of people, because I have this strange thing that I cross so many worlds, and history, genealogy and writing. So people know me on the different levels depending upon what their levels are.
Have you ever met a counterpart to yourself in England or New Zealand? Somebody who has really gone in depth into popular publishing the way you have and been successful. Is there somebody like that in England? Do you know of?
No, not anyone who's come through the genealogy world. So people are writing popular history who've come through the history world, or often the people who are writing popular history are actually journalists because they have a writing style that's more immediate, whereas the academics have a much heavier writing style, so they don't get the mainstream book contracts. So most people writing popular history really have come from the journalist world, and many of them are doing it without knowing what they're really doing, which is fascinating from a conversation with a journalist who writes current true crime. He said, how do you find your information? And I said, go back to the original records. And he just couldn't understand that because he does it all in interviews primarily.
You're talking about the research background for the books.
Yes. Yes, so I guess investigative journalists are the ones who are most likely to be writing popular history. They are not genealogists. I do not know of any other genealogists in the world who are doing what I'm doing.
I think what you're doing is actually a really good role model, perhaps, for genealogists everywhere in the world, especially the ones in Canada or America or the UK, where this is wide open and we don't have anybody filling that gap. I'm stunned that you've had this success in Australia, honestly, because genealogists or people who start from that background in genealogy typically find it an uphill battle with the popular publishers.
That's right. And it's actually very interesting. Most people who are teaching family historians how to write family histories are teaching them how to write boring family histories for the simple reason that they are driven by the facts. They see the facts as the be-all and end-all of a family history. Let's look at the analogy of literature. When a student studies literature at school or university, they are not asked to rehash the plot. They are not asked to give the skeleton of the plot. And that's what most genealogists do when they write a family history. They give the skeleton of the family history, the facts. When a student is asked to study a novel, they are asked to explore the themes and to develop insights and to find essentially the beating heart of the novel. Somehow genealogists have achieved the ability to make family history writing as dry as possible. It's as if they've sapped every bit of last drop of life-giving blood out of their ancestors. They've lost the whole point that all of our ancestors are people with beating hearts. And they don't understand that what you've got to do is to find that beating heart to make it interesting. And this is what I do with my books. I have worked out how to turn something that is really dry into something that's really fascinating by using some of the tools of fiction, like stream of consciousness, like leaving the reader hanging and then jumping to another bit and coming back again. I've done all of that, but primarily by point of view and by immediacy. I tell the story through the characters themselves by the way I write, rather than the very distant, omniscient narrator, which is what most historians and genealogists do. And it's not because I have different records, though in a sense in dealing with true crime I do. I can still make something interesting that anyone else is boring because I know how to do it. And yes, I think there is a void in America and Canada. Paul Milner, who you may know of, was speaking in one of the genealogy cruise earlier this year that I spoke on. No, a year ago now, we're in the wrong year, that I was speaking on. And he came to my Writing Interesting Family History seminars and he said, wow, I have heard nothing like that before. You need to be coming across to America and giving that talk. And, of course, giving more training sessions, which hopefully maybe in 2015.
So what countries are your books available in?
In terms of the peculiar case of the Electric Constable, hard copy all over the English-speaking world. The other popular histories are available in ebook form internationally, but in hard copy in Australia. The Writing Interesting Family Histories and the other how-to books that will be coming, as I mentioned, I've got 7 I want to write in the next 15 months. They will be available through my website. So my website details are www.carolbaxter.com.
Carol, do you have any time for volunteering? Do you do any volunteering work outside of your writing?
The only thing one could classify in a sense as volunteering is giving talks that are unpaid. And also I have a monthly newsletter that I write that offers tips on researching, writing and publishing. So that's a free email newsletter that anyone can contact me and join. Basically, no, I work 7 days a week.
Why don't you tell us the most fun project that you've ever worked on? And it could be anything. It could be a project when you were in England all those years ago. It could be research for one of your books. What's the most fun project if you had to pick one?
The incident that I couldn't call the most fun, I can only do so with hindsight because at the time it was rather strange. I had written a book about a bushranger called Captain Thunderbolt. And there was a certain family historian who managed to get everything about the two protagonists in this book, Captain Thunderbolt and his part Aboriginal lover. He managed to get absolutely everything about these people wrong, to the point of deciding that Thunderbolt actually went to America afterwards and he died in Canada, and they organised to have a parliamentary petition to get Thunderbolt's to get the records relating to Thunderbolt's death released. So the whole thing became quite high profile. And then along came little old me, and I am very little, and said, hold on a second, you're wrong. This is not what happened. Well, when you can't destroy the message, of course, you turn on the messenger. And I start a lot of my talks by saying, I stand before you with knife wounds in my back. These people just set out to destroy me, to the point that Allen and Unwin my publishers had to call in the defamation lawyers. So they were saying things in the newspapers. But in my Thunderbolt website, what I did is I absolutely tore what they said to strips, analytically wise. So this is, if you think about the genealogical proof standard and its guidelines for doing a proof argument, basically I did a massive amount of proof arguments on my Thunderbolt website, absolutely tearing all of their claims to pieces and presenting the evidence. And of course, this got them very frustrated. So there were more and more letters sent to the newspapers, and you just never knew what was going to happen next. So it was probably the most dramatic time as a historian who normally sits in a study or in record offices doing research, to have this situation. I mean, somebody even got a poison letter and they got the police onto it, and they were saying the police were going to come and interview me, all over a bushranger who died 140 years ago. As my publisher at Allen and Unwin said, who would have thought that your little bushranger book could generate this massive attack? So anyway, in hindsight, it actually became quite funny.
Well, what was the point of tension? Was it a racial issue?
No. These people, I talk about it a little bit in some of my books, the genealogists who are driven by ego rather than a desire for truth, or they're driven by a belief. This man was related to Thunderbolt. Thunderbolt was the bushranger gentleman, the gentleman bushranger. He was an outlaw hero. This man was one who'd achieved very little with his life, and so his connection with this bushranger made him important. And so it was all an ego thing, totally and utterly an ego thing. And by having this story that Thunderbolt escaped to America, he took control of the Thunderbolt myth. He basically was the Thunderbolt god, in a sense, if you can imagine. And he was the one that people went to if they wanted information about Thunderbolt. Of course, it was completely wrong. So it was not about anything like racial issue or anything else. It was really ego and somebody's ownership. And I wasn't going to let somebody who believes something that was completely wrong get away with it and try and destroy everyone else, because he had destroyed other people who tried to counter the myth. I wasn't going to let him get away with that, because as far as I'm concerned, beliefs are something that are unsupported by evidence. To get to the truth, we have to use the evidence. We have to use the evidence trail. And it's all very well to have a belief, but the belief does not equal truth. So what I was doing was I was taking that belief and saying, okay, this is what you believe. This is the evidence. This is how we get to the end. This is how we reach the truth. And of course, they couldn't handle that because they wanted to maintain the belief, because the belief gave them an ego boost.
So you were myth busting.
I was myth busting,
yeah.
And that's what I call the pages on my web, myth debunking.
And this is a very, very touchy subject for genealogists, not so much for professionals, but for families who cling to these myths about their families. And in America or anywhere in the world, I think everyone has these problems with these people who want to cling to the myth rather than accepting the evidence, as you say. So,
look, it's fascinating. And the thing is, it isn't just restricted to genealogy. It's restricted, it's part of politics, it's part of religion, it's part of philosophy. Everybody has their beliefs, and they don't want those beliefs to be counted. And there's some fascinating research, political research, that showed when somebody has a belief, if somebody actually presents the evidence to them that shows them that their belief is wrong, far from changing their belief to what is true, they merely become even more stubbornly adhering to that belief. And it is a real problem in genealogy, of course, and part of this book I'm writing on this strategies for determining truth is saying, look, this is broadly the situation. This is what a belief is, and this is if you want the truth. And what is the point in believing that is something that is wrong? People might argue that it comforts them, but surely it isn't comforting if it's wrong and if they know that it's wrong. And they might say it's harmless. Well, let me tell you, these people were so unbelievably nasty. I've encountered quite a few people when I've dealt with evidence like that there is nothing harmless about an incorrect belief. It can be very, very dangerous indeed.
Let's take a quick break to hear a message from the Association of Professional Genealogists.
Hello. This is Kimberly Powell, President-elect of the Association of Professional Genealogists. APG is an international membership organization dedicated to supporting all individuals in the business of genealogy, whether you're an archivist, librarian, educator, writer, or researcher. Our 2,600 members include genealogists at all stages of their professional careers, from those just starting out to some of the field's most renowned leaders. Learn how to grow your business and network with other professionals through our educational webinars, informal mentoring groups, active discussion lists, the APG Quarterly, and our annual Professional Management Conference. Visit us online at apgen.org to learn how we can help you on your professional journey and how you can help us advance public awareness and understanding of the profession of genealogy.
Now, Carol, this interview has been different from other interviews that we've done on the Genealogy Professional Podcast, but we are still going to enter the lightning round, okay?
Okay.
And I'm still going to hit you with some questions, and you're going to come back with brilliant answers for all the genealogists out there, because I think you have a lot of really sound experience and advice that you can pass on even within the context of the questions that are in the lightning round. So are you ready?
Okay, let's go.
What was the one thing you were most afraid of in starting your business? Now, I'm going to say starting your business as when you became a full-time writer.
Not making money.
What's the best advice you've ever received?
How do you eat an elephant one bite at a time?
That is good advice. What is the one specific action listeners can take in the next 24 hours to help them transition into a genealogy career? And it could be a genealogy writing career if you want to take it from that point of view.
Actually, I would have to say listening to podcasts like this one, because you are talking to the people who are actually doing it. So I think that's getting the information from the horse's mouth.
I mean, that's the goal here. So I would encourage that. I encourage and support that answer. Do you have a productivity tool like Dropbox or Evernote that you love that you can share? And it doesn't have to necessarily have to do with genealogy. I know you're using an iPad right now.
I'm afraid this is the first time I've ever used the iPad. It's really just my computer. My computer is my world. I get up in the morning and the first thing I do is turn on the computer, and we do not go on cruises without me taking my laptop with me because I can't live without it. So really, I've had a computer in my life since before most people had one. I got one at the age of 24 in 1984. So a computer is my world.
What is the thing you use the most on your computer? What program?
Word.
Well, that makes sense. You're a writer.
Yeah, I'm a writer.
What is your preferred social media channel?
I can't say I've actually quite worked social media out. I do have a few websites. So I've got a Thunderbolt website and I've got my own website, and I'm going to set up a history detective website. And I do have a Facebook page, and LinkedIn. I haven't quite worked LinkedIn out, though I am going to start putting my history detective newsletters onto LinkedIn when the next one comes out. So this is all an ongoing journey.
If you could recommend one book for our listeners, what would it be?
I'm going to go totally out of the left field here and say Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers. For any of us to achieve success, we need to broaden our minds and see the big picture. And that's what Malcolm Gladwell does in all of his books, but particularly Outliers, which shows how anyone can achieve success.
Well, I think that was a brilliant choice, and I'm glad you mentioned it. He's one of my favorites.
Oh, isn't he amazing?
Yep.
It blows my mind away.
Okay, so hypothetical scenario. All right. We're going to send you to the United States just because we're not a British Commonwealth. And you have to move there. You don't know anyone. You're not familiar with the research. So when you're doing background research for your books, you're encountering a whole new situation. You're not connected to any publishers in the United States. What are you going to do in the first month to hit the ground running and start a new genealogy writing business?
basically what I would do is I would use the internet to find genealogical and historical groups and libraries, and I would contact them and I would offer to give free talks. That would then start to get me known. Now, because I've got books, of course, that can go anywhere, I would immediately have a market for my books as well. But once people heard me, they would go, okay, as you said, I have a level of knowledge that they don't have. So I'd build the business from there. And of course, I'd look around and see if there was a great popular history, true crime story I could write, and I'd start pursuing that.
Perfect. Great answer. Give our audience one parting piece of advice and then tell us how we can get in contact with you.
Broaden your market by monetizing your knowledge. Become a speaker, and then you can turn your talks into books and sell them from the back of the room. That increases your exposure and your income. My contact details is basically my website, www.carolbaxter.com.
Wonderful. Carol, thank you so much for stopping by the Genealogy Professional podcast today. It's been an absolute pleasure having you.
Thank you, Mary.
Anyone who's interested in writing or public speaking as a main component of their genealogy career probably got an awful lot out of that discussion with Carol Baxter. That was a great, candid discussion about the field of writing and speaking with lots of very helpful information. I also love the part about Thunderbolt and myth busting. And that is a very common issue that we have to deal with in genealogy when people cling to stories and beliefs about the past that haven't been verified. And Carol made some really valid points that we need to consider. Now, of course, we need to do an action item for this week. And what better action item than one on writing? Because Carol is a writer and we spent most of our time talking about writing. Every genealogy professional, or at least nearly every genealogy professional, has to do some form of writing. If you're a client researcher, you're probably doing client reports. If you don't do client research, you might focus on speaking and writing articles. And so in that case, you're probably writing articles for journals or magazines. You might be a blogger and write regularly in that format. What I would like you to think about this week is what type of writing do you currently do? Are you writing client reports? Are you doing any type of writing regularly? I know some of you are saying, I don't like to write. And, I have a friend who told me once, she doesn't write articles for magazines because she's terrified of writing. But when you're a genealogist and you're writing reports for clients, you're still writing. And when I had spoken to Kirsty Wilkinson, it was one of the early episodes, she had talked about not doing public speaking. And I think a couple of the other folks who've been on the show also don't like public speaking. Writing is just like public speaking. It takes practice and experience. You heard Carol talk about the 10,000 hours that she put in to become proficient in what she does. It's all a matter about practice and experience. You should try to conquer your fears. Whenever you say to yourself, I'm not going to do that as part of my job because I'm not good at it or I'm afraid of doing it. Warning bells should go off and you should say, this is something I need to tackle. Obviously, I'm not comfortable with this and therefore I need to work harder at this because I'm not comfortable at it. So tackle your fears. Tackle those things that make you uncomfortable. Determine what is it that you're doing in writing. And perhaps if you're doing a lot of report writing, pick a different type of writing to practice, such as writing an article for a magazine. And to do that, you can take a project that you're working on, try a project that's a personal project rather than a client project so that you don't have any privacy issues, and try writing an article just for yourself. Come up with a theme for the article that you think would be interesting to a large audience, and then write the article. Target, 800 to 1,200 words. That would be a reasonable amount to target for a first article. And just write it. And if it's terrible, who cares? Nobody's going to see it but you. And then after you do that, write another one. And then write another one and practice writing. Another thing that you can do to practice your writing, and this is a great way to get in the habit of writing without the pressure of thinking that an editor is going to read it at the end, and that is to blog. If you have your own blog, you're in total control of what you write and when you write, and that could be a great way to introduce you to writing and to make you more comfortable with writing. Now, the only problem with a blog and you being in charge of it is that you might put it off. So you need to set yourself a schedule. So, these action items are pretty much week to week, So let's just make a 1-week schedule, okay, for this action item. Pick something, whether it's going to be an article or a blog or even practicing writing reports. Every day, write a brief article for 1 week. You don't actually have to publish it online if it's a blog, if you're not comfortable with that, but commit to writing for 7 days. And at the end of the 7 days, I bet you will see it's a little bit easier. I think the hardest part is starting. Forcing yourself to do something you're not comfortable doing or you haven't done before can be a little scary. Do it anyway. And then go back the next day and do it again. And go back the next day. And after 7 days, if you've completed a writing task for 7 days, even if it's not good in your eyes, you will have achieved something because you will now have more experience writing and more practice writing. So for this week, I want you to think about what you write currently. Think about what you could use as your writing action item for the next 7 days, and then sit down and commit to it and try to make yourself a little bit more comfortable with writing. Until next week, so long.